All right, just started streaming whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Weaving Together Histories at the Auburn Avenue Research Library panel. I'm Afia Vassall, Library Associate who works in the Archives Division, and I'll be moderating with my colleague, Derek Mosley, our archivist and manager of the Archives Division. We are here to have a discussion about archival research. We're going to dive into unique histories discovered here within our reading room and talk about best practices and strategies for making the most out of your archival visit. Questions will be taken at the end of our panel discussion. Our archive division supports the credibility of research topics by providing primary source materials. These materials include publications, correspondences, photographs, ephemera, and a variety of other record types. The materials are sourced from notable figures and organizations. The donated items are organized into collections. Each collection falls under a branch of our main collecting areas or subject matters. These subject matters include the civil rights movement, religious histories, art, the history of the LGBTQ community, and Atlanta history. Today, we are joined by 4 scholars who have conducted research in our archive. Dr. Ben Holtzman is Assistant Professor of History at Lehman College and author of The Long Crisis, New York City, and the Path to Neoliberalism. Dr. Vincent Lloyd is Professor and Director of the Center for Political Theology at Villanova University. His previous books include Black Dignity, The Struggle Against Domination, and Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons. Dr. Kristian Phillips is sociocultural anthropologist at Emory University. Her first book, An Ethnography of Hunter, won the 2020 Society for Economic Anthropology Book Prize. She is partnered with research fellow Janaki Radhakrishnan, whose focus area is The Clearing, Nature's Play as Black Liberation Methodology. Molly Garfinkel is Managing Director of City Lore and the Director of City Lore's Place Matters program. Both roles enable her to lead initiatives related to cultural resource management, historic preservation, public history, exhibition curation, public education, and traditional arts presentation. To begin our panel discussion, each scholar will speak on their research projects that were supported and expanded by the Auburn Avenue Research Library. First, we will begin with Molly Garfinkel.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be with you all here today. Thank you so much again for including me in this conversation. As Afia said, I'm Molly Garfinkel. I am actually the co-director at City Lore, which is a cultural conservation not-for-profit based in New York City, though we do work nationwide. And I'm a public historian. And I have been, for the last almost decade, researching what is known as CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, and its impact on culture workers across the United States. So most people have heard of the WPA in some form or fashion, or know artists who were involved with the WPA, but very few people know about CETA. The WPA, of course, Federal Project One was the greatest government investment in culture workers in the United States. And CETA actually unintentionally in the 1970s became almost like a second round of the WPA. In over 200 places across the country, large, small, urban, rural, coastal, central, indigenous territories, artists were able to be employed through CETA, largely through Title VI. There were many titles of the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, but Title VI was for public service employment. And that actually ended up employing over 22,000 culture workers of every imaginable description. There were about almost 2,050 different job titles that one could have as a culture worker, broadly speaking, from administrators to practitioners, even security guards at cultural institutions. And so it really ended up becoming a huge lift for what was then a pretty nascent public arts infrastructure. The NEA and the NEH were just founded in 1965. And by the time the Nixon administration launches CETA in 1973, most states had state arts councils, but many local cities and municipalities didn't have more local arts agencies. So in addition to employing culture workers, and this is humanities, artists, everybody, CETA also helped to either establish or stabilize local arts agencies, which actually ended up being true in Atlanta as well. And so through City Lore, I've been collaborating with the director of another arts nonprofit called Artists Alliance Inc., Jody Weinberg. And together we have been researching CETA's impact across the country. And we started in New York City, where we're both based, and did an exhibition in 2021 at the peak of the Omicron wave during the pandemic. Sort of with the understanding that the pandemic had a totally deleterious effect on culture workers, and culture workers were subject to major job and income losses, somewhat similarly to CETA. And as a consequence of this exhibition, we were awarded funding from the Mellon Foundation to expand our research across the country. And Atlanta was always one of our prime targets. And so in CETA was very unlike the WPA, decentralized. And so that means it was administered differently in different places. Some places had citywide or countywide or even almost regional within a very large state, administered CETA cultural worker projects. That's how it was in New York City and in San Francisco. But Atlanta, Mayor Maynard Jackson actually helped to create the Bureau of Cultural Affairs with CETA funding, and then through that send funding to extant or nascent cultural organizations. And the Neighborhood Arts Center was really one of the best examples. And so my research at Auburn Avenue Research Library focused on the records of the Neighborhood Arts Center, which was, as Dr. Candy Tate in a totally fantastic dissertation noted, one of the Black arts movement's southern regional limbs. And it employed, and again, it's a part of sort of an important distinction, employed, not a grant. It was a job. There was a ton of reporting that had to be done, a lot of paperwork, sort of strict regulations coming from the Federal Department of Labor all the way down through the culture workers themselves. And so this was a real learning opportunity for a lot of very new organizations who both got administrative positions and cultural artistic positions through CETA, but it also enabled many of them to continue after CETA funding was ended. It continued through Ford and was expanded through the Carter administration and then ended by the Reagan administration in 1982. And so you have all manner of artists, total multidisciplinary at the Neighborhood Arts Center, run by visual artist John Riddle. You have visual artist Tina Dunkley, you have Tony K. Bambara, you have Iban Dooley, you have Alice Lovelace, literary artists, Joe Jennings, John Coley Eaton, performing artists, Fred Taylor, Walter Dallas, Samuel L. Jackson, Jamandi Productions, just tons of theater and dance as well. And it also was a sort of a centralizing mechanism for the Black community, really grassroots Black arts community, to come together, to organize, to educate, to mutually support. And so that's what my research has been focused on. And the goal in the long run is to open an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, that goes to the various case studies. We have 9 case studies, including Atlanta, and we'll open this exhibition about CETA arts and culture at the CUNY Graduate Center in Manhattan next fall for the fall semester, and then travel it around the country.
Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Kristian Phillips and Janaki Radhakrishnan.
Hello, everyone, and I too want to thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'm presenting today. I'm Kristian Phillips from Emory University, the Department of Anthropology. I'm presenting today together with one of my students and someone I worked with as research assistant. She's been a research assistant working with me the last few years, really, since she was a first year student. And so it is a treat to get to talk to you all today about one of our more recent projects together. I'm not going to spend too much time on context for the project because I want to let Janaki talk a little bit more about the perspective of a student being in the archive. But I did want to say just a few things about the two projects that our time in the archives this summer was working towards. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, which means I tend to work a little bit more in the present than in the past. But my time in the archives was focused on two projects I have going. One is on the disproportionate impact of high electricity bills on low-income families in Georgia and actually all over the South, specifically on Black households. And I was so my project, my book project that I'm working on right now is very much about that issue in the present. We have a very monopolistic utility environment here, but I'm really interested in the impacts of that on people's everyday lives, and also kind of its impact on how people experience home, that it impacts on housing precarity, housing security, etc. And so our time archives was what part of it was trying to look at some Georgia Power historical archives that were actually located mostly in the NAACP files. And then I also have a second sub project that's part of a research collective that I'm part of on the historical intersections of race and electric utilities in the United States, where we're conducting oral histories with frontline electrical workers, like meter bays, line workers, customer service representatives, to try and understand, to understand utilities and these like very technical beasts of electric grids as a product of everyday labor of a much wider group of people than how we normally think about them. And so those were kind of two things that we were interested in looking at when we were in the archives this morning. We found a couple of main things we found were a handwritten report of an NAACP officer trying to make sense of Georgia's regulatory environment for utilities, why electric bills were so high in the 1970s and 80s, and why that seemed to be so hard to change. And honestly, it could have been written today, everything in it. We found a few activist newspapers, the Great Speckled Bird and the Georgia Power Project, which talked about efforts to fight Georgia Power's rate hikes in the late 70s and early 80s. And probably most powerful were complaints filed over time by Black workers to the NAACP against Georgia Power, claiming mistreatment and discrimination, and just complaint after complaint after complaint. And these complaints culminated in legal action, as well as other measures by the NAACP to pressure Georgia Power into addressing these pretty major labor issues. So this has been so valuable because it's allowed me to kind of contextualize the present with the past, because frankly, Georgia Power's archives are completely inaccessible. So going in sideways through these other institutions that have interacted with them over the years is just being able to do that as a gift. And then we're also using some of the names in the later files to try and track down people for oral series. But Jackie, I'm turning things over to Jackie now so she can talk a little bit about what she took from the experience.
Yeah, hi, and thank you so much again to Auburn Avenue Research Library and to Dr. Phillips for the opportunity to be here and speak. I think as a student in Black Studies, and I think for all students who really kind of are seeking to represent underrepresented communities through their work, the archives are a pretty invaluable tool because of the way that they allow us to really see the way that the power structures we're trying to interrogate through our work were actually built by this sort of like piece by piece, all these little acts of everyday sort of mundane violence, right? And I think that that is really what Dr. Phillips was speaking to with that NAACP collection of complaints from Georgia Power workers that eventually culminated into this huge lawsuit. It really just sort of gave you a mirror into all of the little tiny things that built up to create this sort of massive issue that we're looking at. And I think it does that in a way that infuses like a humanness and a sort of life into these systems that is really reflective of the way that they actually function. Um, and I think from my standpoint as both a student and a community organizer and someone who has a lot of reservations, but ultimately hopes that my scholarship will support the project of collective liberation, um, the archives are really great because they remind me that that struggle is long, right? And that just as much as there are all these everyday violences, there's also, we found so many instances of everyday acts of resistance and resilience. And um, I don't know, I think that's really comforting. I should also acknowledge that working in the archives, I think particularly as a young scholar, can be really overwhelming because of the weight of the things that we're studying, right? I think even once you get past the kind of nerves of working with these really old, really important documents that sort of feel like you shouldn't be allowed to touch them, when you're under the vision and guidance of someone else, as I have been with Dr. Phillips, as most of us are as research assistants, it just is really hard to figure out what's relevant and what's salient. And I have sort of constantly felt the pressure of my own biases, and the reality that you have to balance your excitement and interest and a very real desire to give every document the time and sort of reverence that they deserve, with the realities of deadlines and of time constraints. Um, and I think that tension can be really anxiety inducing, but I would encourage other students to sort of look at it as part of the beauty of archival work. Because as much as you don't want to write anything off as inconsequential, that's the thing. All of it is consequential. All of it is something that someone valued enough to keep, and its presence in the archives informs your perspective, and even if you just skim it, it allows you to build this sort of like immersive landscape of your project that I think is really valuable, particularly when you're a young scholar, really trying to figure out where you fit into the academy, where your work fits in, to have that sort of context, um, just really helps you discern who you're writing with, who you're writing to, and who you're writing for. And the last thing that I'll say is to that end, um, again, I think particularly within Black studies, any opportunities that we have to carry our ancestors with us in our work, and in our sort of struggle, I think that it's a privilege and a responsibility for us to take advantage of that. And I think that I would encourage all students to take advantage of archival resources, even if you don't end up using them in whatever you publish and whatever you produce. I think it's just such an invaluable experience to inform your work and your scholarship.
Peter, unmuted.
Muted. Okay, thank you so much. Now we hear from Dr. Ben Holtzman.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'm Ben Holtzman. I'm an assistant professor of history at Lehman College as part of the City University of New York. It's really, again, I appreciate the invitation. It's really great to hear about all these research projects, and it's also really a treat to speak in correlation with the Auburn Avenue Research Library, which is really such a beacon of African American history and of Atlanta history, and I think importantly is also as a kind of public institution, serves a really important role in the preservation of history and archival materials. So the project that brings me there, and I have come on and off since 2019 and working on this project, so it's been quite a while now, is Smash the Klan, Fighting the White Power Movement in the late 20th Century. So the project is thinking about the growth of white power organizing in the United States in the late 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. Some people might be familiar with the Greensboro Massacre, which occurs in 1979, in which 5 anti-racist activists were murdered by members of the Klan and Nazis. And that was representative, or at least a reflection, of the growth of white power organizing that begins to really take off in the late 1970s and continues into the next years ahead. What I'm doing in this project is really thinking about the movements that formed to combat that the white power organizing during this period. So the organization that I am principally examining is called the National Anti-Klan Network, which becomes the Center for Democratic Renewal. Forms in 1979, becomes the Center for Democratic Renewal in the mid-1980s. And I'm trying to think about a variety of things in the projects. One is just to really, of course, trace the tactics and strategies that these activists were using to combat the growth of the white power movement. So they employed a number of strategies to do so, from developing public protests to opposition. Anytime the Klan or Nazi folks appeared somewhere, developing lawsuits in response to against civil lawsuits against perpetrators of racial violence, trying to get the federal officials and the Justice Department to take action, educational campaigns. So really thinking about the variety of tactics that they used and developed during this period to combat this threat. But another so in addition to really thinking about tactics and strategies and just really tracing movement history, I'm also thinking about some of the connections that organizing during this time in the 1980s especially had with the civil rights movement of the preceding decades. So 2 of the founders of the National Anti-Klan Network were C.T. Vivian and Ann Braden. C.T. Vivian was an associate of Martin Luther King, was a leader in SCLC. Ann Braden was one of the most committed Southern white civil rights activists and paid dearly for her efforts, along with her husband, Carl. So they helped to form this organization. And I'm really kind of thinking about this work, anti-fascist or anti-white power organizing during this period, as one of the trajectories of where sort of civil rights, we can kind of trace the influence of civil rights directly through organizers into the late 20th century. And also thinking about the kind of new generation of activists and anti-racist social justice kind of organizers that formed during this period or as part of this movement work, and that kind of intergenerational relationship. Those are some of the kind of themes that I'm working with and some of the things I'm thinking through, as well as really also trying to think about the influence of white power and white nationalism in American politics during that period. Of course, along with the fight back that is trying to challenge it, trying to think about the influence of white power organizing in American society more broadly, but also really thinking about the role of left politics and organizing and trying to, push back against it, and the currents of left organizing and social movements in what we might think of as a particularly conservative period of the long 1980s under Reagan and the like. But this organizing did, at least for a period, have the white power movement kind of on the retreat in some really powerful ways. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much. Our final presenter will be Dr. Vincent Lloyd.
Thanks for having me. I got to use the Auburn Avenue Research Library as I was working on a biography of Harold Cruse. Cruse is now often forgotten, but in the late 1960s and 1970s was one of the preeminent Black intellectuals, probably mentioned in the same breath as people like James Baldwin, Stokely Carmichael, and his friend Amiri Baraka. 1967 saw the publication of The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, which was sort of a blockbuster book, a book that everyone was carrying around on college campuses, in organizing spaces, a book that sort of named challenges in Black intellectual life through Cruz telling his own story of trying to navigate Black political spaces in the mid 20th century, and also endorsed a vision of something like Black nationalism, although Cruz had his own sort of idiosyncratic way of understanding Black nationalism. Cruz was a figure whose life transformed after the publication of that book. He had been working basically manual labor jobs, working in a department store loading clothing. And then when his book was published in 1967, it becomes a celebrity more or less overnight, becomes a professor overnight. He becomes a tenured professor at the University of Michigan, where he spends the last few decades of his life. He becomes a professor in his mid-50s and stays in Ann Arbor, Michigan, far from New York, until his death in 2005. He was born in 1916. I mean, there, right, he sort of navigates what it means to be someone who dropped out of high school, who's now a university professor, someone who's committed to Black political organizing, but is now a part of a university bureaucracy. He mentors generations of Black students, but also tries to think about what it means to be mentoring Black students in a way that gives them space to self-organize rather than sort of seeing himself as a leader or a kind of father figure. And he becomes instrumental in the development of Black studies as a field. As there's more and more interest in Black studies in the last few years in the US, Cruz's role in creating the field, I think, is often forgotten, as stories are about student activism, which of course is a huge part of the story of the creation of Black studies, but the intellectual life of Black studies in its first few years often revolved around reading of Cruz's book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. Skip Gates said he read it 3 times when he was an undergraduate student in 3 different classes. So part of my project is sort of recovering Cruz's voice there and the way he navigated inside and outside of academic institutions. He was also a rather mysterious figure in his own right. The birth and death dates given in his New York Times obituary didn't match the birth and death certificates that I found when looking him up. Sometimes he said he was married. Sometimes he didn't say he was married. I went to a cemetery to try and find his grave. It's not there. It's not where it says it should be. So he had all these sorts of mysteries around him. He couldn't decide where to leave his papers. Some of them went to Virginia, then he took them back from Virginia. Some of them went to New York, and then he was convinced by the then head of Auburn Avenue to support Black institutions by sending his papers to Auburn Avenue Research Library, which was its own kind of fiasco. It was going, the papers were being taken in a snowstorm, and Cruz was very picky about what he wanted to go and what he wanted to keep. And so he was going through every box, and then they realized that they couldn't bring the papers to the U-Haul and beat the snowstorm back to Atlanta if they let him go through all the papers. So they said they would send him an inventory later, which happened 20 years later after he was dead. So all sorts of interesting stuff in Auburn Avenue around Cruz's life, ranging from physical objects of his to correspondence. Sylvia Wynter was a close, probably intimate friend of his, and there's a Sylvia Wynter Harold Cruz correspondence there. He had a Japanese girlfriend for a time, and they had this sort of intricate romance around the world, very interesting letters around that. I discovered he maintained his apartment in New York well after he moved to Ann Arbor and was going back and forth. That wasn't clear from talking to people who knew him, that he maintained this life in New York. In a more political light, Cruz was a co-founder of, or instrumental leader of the Freedom Now Party, the first all-Black political party that contested the elections in 63, 64. He worked with Grace Lee Boggs in Michigan, and he was sort of heading up the New York political side of that operation. The Grace Lee Boggs, James Boggs, Cruz correspondence, much of it is there in Auburn Avenue, and is fascinating to look at how they navigated both ideological differences and then getting stuff done. Grace Lee Boggs was very invested in doing stuff, registering people to vote, getting out and seeing people. Cruz was more in the world of ideas, but also had a whole set of plans for how he could build community through this political party project in Harlem. I was told by the former director of Auburn Avenue that Cruz wrote some lyrics that Nina Simone sang. I didn't find those lyrics. They're somewhere in those boxes at Auburn Avenue. One day someone will find them. Still more mysteries of Harold Cruz left. The biography should be out in September, October 26th from Yale University Press. Thank you.
Thank you all for your amazing presentations. Now each speaker will have the opportunity to reflect on their experiences conducting research at AARL and discuss their strategies and best practices for archival research. We will start off this portion of the discussion with our first question. I feel like some of you already answered this question. I'll read it out, and whoever feels like they weren't able to touch on that in their presentation, you can feel free to answer. Which AARL collection or item most changed the direction of your research, and how?
I can start. So the two collections that I looked at were the sort of Greater Neighborhood Arts Center collection and then a sub-collection of their financial records. And part of the point of our project is to really try to demonstrate for those who don't know or advocate for the value of culture workers in society on every imaginable level. But there's so many stereotypes that persist around culture workers, particularly around artists. And if you take a look at those financial records, you will know very, very quickly and very clearly how much work went on behind the scenes. It wasn't just about giving workshops and performances and working with seniors and with young people. It was a overwhelming amount of paperwork, of financial acumen, of political will building with local elected officials and at sort of every level all the way up to the top, including Joan Mondale, Joan of Arc, the second lady during Carter's administration, who was a huge supporter of CETA and the arts, as well as Assistant Secretary of Labor Ernest Green, who is better known as being the eldest of the Little Rock Nine, but who was a absolutely integral support for the proliferation of CETA-funded arts projects around the country. And then you see all of that information in the financial records. And you also just see how, quite frankly, the very striking difference between this being a grant-funded initiative and a jobs-based, it's different types of paperwork. You're getting W-2s, you're getting all different kinds of benefits. And in fact, when we did our exhibition in New York City about the large New York City group, and this has been true of almost all the case studies, people held on to their stuff. So the stuff that's not in a collection, and this is a very, very comprehensive, like a dream to research in this collection relative to some of the other sort of cobbling together that we've had to do. And I will say that oral history has been a tremendously important strategy in putting this history together because so little, almost nothing has been written about it, but it impacted so many people's lives. And it was about as temporally distant to us now as it was then from the WPA. So memory had sort of faded. There was sort of a sort of mystification around this process and this whole legislation and what actually happened. So having the cold hard facts in paper in receipts, literal receipts, and figurative receipts, but also literal receipts, you see how much work it took and also how possible it is to do again, to replicate in some form or fashion. And quite frankly, how deserving the cultural sector is of government support, and private sector support, of course, of public support, but of jobs and opportunities that are publicly supported. So, yeah.
Is there anybody else who want to add?
Just very briefly, Harold Cruz was, his parents were not married when he was born. They were very poor. He ended up being raised by extended family, so far away from his home. And the Auburn Avenue has correspondence with Cruz's correspondence with his mother later in life when they sort of reconnected, which was really, the relationship was really a black box to me before. I had no idea how he thought about what it meant to have a mother who didn't raise him, and sort of seeing the letters that he wrote her was I think helped me sort of think about his relationship with her in a new light. I also discovered very randomly that he stayed when I went to visit his family, his extended family in Virginia, where they were from. I randomly stayed at the same hotel that he stayed at when he went to visit his mother, which was such a coincidence to find the hotel receipt in the archive, and that was the place I was just at.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't think I said so explicitly, but the principal organization that I'm looking at, the Center for Democratic Renewal, their papers are at Auburn Avenue. So that's the collection that I principally work with there. And it's 400 something boxes, I think echoing something that Molly said about the sort of extensiveness. I mean, it's just an enormous collection of not just 400 something boxes, but 400 something just extremely packed boxes of materials. And so there isn't, I wouldn't say, a particular item or that has necessarily or inherently shifted the focus of the project. But I think one of the pleasures, and also maybe kind of, the reason why I've been working on it for a while now, is that there's just an enormous amount of material. But the gift of that, of course, as particularly for a historian or anybody who's doing historical research, is the ability to kind of be comprehensive and getting that sort of exhaustive look from an administrative research kind of strategy development level. So I'm really grateful for both those materials being available. And of course, that makes the project being able to have access to those materials. And I think maybe also echoing the comment that the prior comment about just, you find cool stuff in the archive. I mean, even if it doesn't necessarily shift the one item, for me at least, doesn't shift the entire direction, but it does. I know there was this protest in '82 in DC against the Klan marching, and I know it created rifts in the movement, but I'm not sure exactly what the story was. And you are gifted a folder that somebody preserved that preserves correspondence between different participants in the movement about what that riff was, or finding information about debates about homophobia among activists, and how much attention should be paid amongst anti-queer violence versus anti-racial violence, and all those sorts of things that are the heart of any kind of historical project, right? That it's through that preservation that doesn't necessarily take the project in a 180 or 90-degree kind of turn, but fleshes out the project in really rich ways.
Is that everyone? All right. The next question is, what was your most useful research tactic in the archive that others could utilize?
I'm happy to start with that one. And I would say John McGee was my best research tactic. So it was, I think it was just really rewarding. I've never worked with anyone else. I mean, I worked side by side with people in the archives, on our own projects, but I haven't had anyone specifically sort of working with me on my own questions, and I just found it so fruitful to not only, I mean, it's not just a matter of getting through more stuff, but making meaning of it and sort of building the bigger picture, because you can get all these sort of dots that archival materials represent, but you need to also put them together to understand sort of what that bigger picture is. And I feel like we were able to sort of construct and deconstruct and reconstruct as we were working, and we actually had because a lot of my research is focused in Southwest Georgia. I didn't focus on that in what I talked about earlier, but we also looked at the different set of files around Southwest Georgia, and so those each of those kind of mini projects had its own life as we were talking.
I would say, I think just to add to that, and thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for the appreciation. But I think one of the things that was sort of the hardest for me to figure out, and that I'm still figuring out as a research assistant, is managing the organization of all of these files, right? Because I mean, you get these huge boxes, and there's so much, and it really is quite overwhelming. And figuring out how to keep all of that kind of structured and organized and keeping yourself accountable when you're scanning documents, I think is a lot. So one thing that I would definitely say is be very clear on how you are going to like categorize and label sources before you go in, so that as you're scanning, you are able to do that as you go along, because it's definitely a lot harder when you have a bunch of random unnamed files, and you then have to go back through and figure out what they are, and how to, what box did this come from, what folder in what box. Yeah. So that was one thing that I don't think that I had even thought about when I came in. And that I think was a really good learning experience.
And it's best to learn that from a historian and not from an.
Okay, I'll ask the next question. Thank you all again for participating in this session. I am learning quite a bit about the collections that we have at Auburn. So our next question is, where did your project push against the dominant historical narratives, and what evidence from AARL enabled that shift? So were there already some thoughts in your mind with the history of these collections or people or groups? And did you find some other um, objects and materials that shifted you?
I can start. So one of the things that I'm thinking about or wanted to kind of explore as part of the project was to the dominant, but I think still remains, it's been increasingly challenged by historians, but I think remains a popular conception of the 1980s as a period in which the left is basically like dead through the influence of the rise of the conservative movement, or divisions over identity, and things have basically fallen apart. And while I think that there is some certainly truth to it being an era that is one of conservatives maintaining principal amounts of power, I was interested in really thinking about not just the kind of ways in which left organizing continues, but also in which coalitions could be successfully multiracial, intergenerational, challenging homophobia, thinking about sort of gender diversity. And there was a lot of materials that I was thankfully able to find that allowed me to think through those issues in the collection. And so while I certainly wouldn't say that those issues didn't remain difficult and challenging from an organizing perspective, and to kind of maintain those, um, you know, uh, thinking about, various kinds of interlocking identities, how that plays into internal dynamics of a movement, how that plays out for the work that's being done on the ground. I think that, I found a lot of evidence that movements and groups were really able to grapple with those questions and organize well, while being attuned to various kinds of issues of identity and difference, and through the materials at Auburn Avenue.
I can just say that, and again, I can't say enough wonderful words about first of all, your wonderful staff. I just want to say it has been a pleasure to work with you all. You were extremely accommodating. I never book enough time at archives, and so I really appreciate you guys accommodating a last minute sort of desperate day. And my realizing I had to come back and a whole cart left of boxes to go through. And of course, those were sort of key to some of the stuff I was looking for. Always it's the last one. But it really, I think seeing this very well-rounded collection, as I mentioned, the material is dispersed throughout institutions and personal collections across the country. Nothing almost at all is listed with CETA, because there were so many levels down that each institution or person recognized themselves as being part of. Of course, they knew what CETA was, but it didn't metadata with CETA. So it's like real archaeology, which I love doing that kind of research. But it really made clear the sort of meta purpose of our project, which for the moment is, of course, to get this history out there and to have it hopefully influence policy into the future around cultural organizing, the cultural sector, but is to do an exhibition. It's a very visual project. It's very based and rooted in story. I can't also say enough about how generous people have been in sharing very extensive interview sessions and oral history sessions with us. We've collected about 120 interviews since we started a decade ago. And that was a strategy that was being used, in fact, by some of the folks during CETA. They recognized how precious and rare and unique this moment was. And so the fact that people held on to their materials and really truly everything from their life insurance policy to their maternity leave benefits to their pink slips when it ended, all types of correspondence. But so this really broad range of typologies of materials to help tell the story to very different audiences. And we really don't want this just to be an exhibition that is an internal conversation, an echo chamber for within the cultural sector, for people who don't think about what all goes into a program like this, or what artists do or cultural workers do, or how you would manage this kind of an initiative. And that includes not just the paperwork documentation, but slides and negatives and contact sheets that documentation of a moment to help prove the point for the future. And I think that not all the groups had the resources to do that or the time. That the Neighborhood Arts Center did that. They had Jim Alexander photograph. I mean, his collection at Emory also is totally unbelievable. But these kinds of documents in conversation with each other are just, it's so fortunate to have the ability to tell the story so many different ways and so visually. And all of your collection in tandem with that collection, in tandem with oral history and other kinds of materials, is just so incredibly rich to be able to tell the story and reach lots of different constituents. So I think that sitting with your collection really made clear to me that all of these different types of material, and then we're not even, and that's, it's a project about the history of artists. It's really not an artwork based exhibition. And so, because quite frankly, a lot of the artwork doesn't exist anymore. It was time-based. It was very in the community space. It was public murals. It was done temporarily. So relying on these materials is necessary for telling the story.
Just see briefly, there's a kind of origin story about the Black Arts movement that starts with Amiri Baraka in Harlem and the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School, which is usually told from the Baraka perspective because he sort of wrote about it and he was sort of interviewed about it, and that sort of formed the core of the historiography. Cruz was working with Baraka to start the school side of the theater and school, and Cruz kept a bunch of early flyers and programs and schedules related to that sort of formative moment of the Black Arts movement. And I think the extent to which it was sort of aspired to be really community-based, right? They would get avant-garde musicians on the back of a truck and drive around Harlem and create some gatherings as they were driving around, and then do these educational classes in the evening for sort of students working, adult students working day jobs. The texture of that, I think, is, maybe not a total pivot from the dominant historical narrative, but certainly fills in and sort of inflects how that origin story is told.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from the audience. The first one is, what suggestions do you have for documenting anti-racist organizing? What suggestions do you have for documenting anti-racist organizing?
Well, I hope anybody else would weigh in, but I think one of the, I mean, great question. I mean, I do think that like there is been, I can just, I mean, this is probably a really general statement, but I also think about like, obviously, I'm very grateful for the CDR collection that it's at Auburn Avenue, but there's a number of other organizations that, for instance, just in the kind of tiny slice in the history of anti-racist organizing that I'm looking at, in this tiny little world relative to the long history of anti-racist organizing. And just within that slice of that history, how many groups' papers are just out there? I mean, they're not archived anywhere, or they're in closets, or they're in basements. You know, I think that many of the materials actually do still exist, but they're not actually being preserved in any way, and they might be discarded as people get older and pass away. So just a kind of general pitch to have those materials move into archives. And I have this conversation, I mean, for my prior work in New York, I've kind of had this conversation with organizations and people to try to get things preserved. But I think, you know, once you start to kind of scratch the surface from a historical perspective of a kind of movement or era, and you really realize how many materials are just kind of being lost all the time. So whether it's somebody who was a participant or from a kind of more archival perspective, to be looking for those materials, I think just in a general sense is just huge.
I think, and I'm not sure whether the question is surrounding like documenting current movements or tracing past ones. But one thing that I would say, particularly from my perspective as an organizer and an organizer under our current political conditions, I think that historically and presently, a lot of folks in activist spaces have a lot of hesitancy surrounding any sort of formal institution, right? And that is not unfounded. It's actually extremely well founded. And so I encourage organizers to look as well um, into more community-based forms of um, archiving, into doing, do oral histories with your elders. Ask, most of our grandparents were alive and well during the civil rights movement, during a lot of the things that we're struggling. Ask them about it. Ask them what they have, and then find ways to, as much of a phenomenal resource as Auburn Avenue is, and as formal archives are, we are also our best resources. And these institutions don't exist without people doing the on-the-ground work to kind of figure out what do we have and what do we want to do with it. And that could be putting it in a formal institution. And I think that there is so much to gain from that. Um, and I also think that there are so many other ways that we can preserve our histories. Um, and so I would encourage us to reach out and build relationships internally, and then also build relationships with these institutions, because I think once you start reaching out and sort of talking with folks about, oh, hey, I have this stuff, like, do you guys think it would be a fit? You can very quickly get a sense of which institutions have the culture and philosophy and intentions that that align with yours. And I think Auburn Avenue is one such place.
Okay, we only have less than 5 minutes. There's one more question I believe one person could answer. How can we effectively preserve history against misinterpretations from AI or social media? If anybody wants to grab that one. Well, thank you all
I
for
can,
joining.
I can,
Oh, okay.
sorry, I can just throw in my 2 cents. I mean, I think I maybe sound like a broken record, but a lot of the times, right, like again, we are the best resource that we have, and archival work in conversation with interviews and like being actually on the ground with folks, I think is that really elevates it, and it will also give us a little more context into like what really happened, a little bit more interpretive guidance that I think could be really valuable to researchers in terms of protecting documents from like the monster that is AI. I don't know. But I think that we have to rely on our face-to-face relationships as much as possible in this kind of climate and in a climate of misinformation. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, thanks. That was the last question from the audience. Thank you all for joining the panel. That concludes our session for today. Thank you for joining us. All right. Thank you, guys.